All right, I would say let's go
Yeah,
ahead.
I think we will start. Hey everyone, welcome to the Code of Professional Conduct webinar. My name is Eden and I will be monitoring everyone. Just few ground rules. Please stay on mute, and if you have any questions, please write it in the chat and we will address it. I will pass to Steve that will take us through this webinar. Or Sarah, you're first, right? Sarah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah, and I'm helping organize the RSA PAC event. Just please save the date for April 30th. We're going to be hosting a day of events alongside Kim Moore from UNI Ventures. The day is going to start with a breakfast, and then there's going to be working sessions for CISOs, led by CISOs. Just please note, if you've already RSPV'd, the date has changed to the 30th. And we're going to be hosting additional events throughout the week. So please keep your eye out for more details to come. And now I'm going to hand it over to Steve.
Sarah, do you know the time?
So the breakfast is going to start at 9 and
Okay,
it's going to end around 5. But towards the end of the day, it's going to become more informal. The programming will happen earlier.
thank you.
Yep.
All right, Eden, Sarah, thank you very much. So I'm Steve Zalewski. I will be the moderator for today's panel. This panel is being put on by the Professional Association of CISOs, which is a relatively new association of 6 months old, whose charter is to be able to establish not certification for cybersecurity, but to take on the larger understanding that cybersecurity as a practice for 20 years has now reached a stage where we need to make it a profession similar to the American Medical Association or the American Bar Association or CPA. And so today's panelists will be discussing the code of conduct that we're establishing for the PAC that is the basis for the profession itself to be established. So with that, I really excited to introduce David Cross, Steve Dufour, and Heather Hinton. All have been CISOs and are current CISOs, and between them have a wealth of experience that have all agreed to, facilitate this conversation with me and also put a lot of work into the code of conduct and the associated documents that make up the underpinnings, right, of the professional association that we're establishing. So goals and objectives for today are relatively simple, which is, what is the code of conduct? Why did we establish it? And what is the value proposition for such a code for CISOs that we've decided it's worth all of this time and effort to get right as a foundational document? And that over the course of the 45 minutes or so, we're going to go into that conversation. We're going to dive in for the folks on this call to appreciate what it is that we're trying to accomplish and how this document is key to the professional association, as well as how you can take advantage of it even starting today in your operational role as a CISO, or if you're planning to be a CISO or work with a CISO, to be able to appreciate the ways that we have to think about the risks associated with the position, as well as how that translates into both protecting our companies and protecting ourselves against our companies. As I said earlier, there's the practice of cybersecurity, which is we've been doing it for 25 years. And it's primarily a technical role. And yet in the last 5 to 7 years, what you're seeing is the technology component is starting to become deprecated to the business responsibilities, which means as individual practitioners, the profession of cybersecurity is starting to emerge, that we have a larger role, or we're demanding a larger role, or we're being given a larger role, and yet appreciating the risks of having a target on your chest by the bad guys and potentially on your back by your executive team is part of this transition that we're going through to realize we need more formalization to establish this type of a profession so that together we can understand how we bring an emerging profession forward. As we go through this, we're gonna talk about canons. And I just want to be clear with everybody, right? Which is canons, if you want to think about it, are the fundamental requirements. It's what we have to do. And under the canons are tenets. Tenets are like rules of practice. They are our ways of being able to give you guidelines as to how to implement the requirements so that if you follow the processes, you can then demonstrate that you did it as correctly as you could given the body of knowledge that we have. Right? So just think about it. Tenets are the fundamental, or the canons are the fundamental requirements. Okay. And then the practice guidelines are our way of giving you examples, so to speak, as to how to implement, to follow the spirit and intent of the canons. All right. Next slide, please. So these are the 6 principles. These are the canons that we're going to discuss now with the panelists over the next 40 or so minutes. So to start with that, what I'd like to do is ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and spend a couple of minutes to help us understand why they think the effort of establishing the code of conduct was so important that they're willing to take their valuable time and effort and invest it into this document and into these particular principles. So I'm going to start with Heather. Take a couple of minutes on background, talk about why this is, you're passionate about this, why you see the problem emerging, and why we want to fix it now.
Sure. Thank you, Steve. So I will say that as a professional engineer by training, I've had a code of ethics that I've had to follow kind of my entire career. And it's actually sort of surprising to me that we didn't have one, surprising and not surprising that we didn't have one for cybersecurity professionals. We all have individual ones, right? If you've got a CSSP, you might have one. If you're an engineer, you have one. If you're a member of the ACM, you have one, but we don't have a consolidated one that cybersecurity practitioners follow. And as the role of the CISO or the security leader has increased in scope, and as we have had things like increased buying power and influence, we have found ourselves, we've all heard stories of CISOs that have kind of ended up in these positions where they've had to make sort of moral decisions, right? Should I do this? Is this, I'm going to benefit from this as well as my company. Is this the right thing to do? Or we've heard stories about people who've been put into positions where they've been asked to do things that they don't actually agree with. And we haven't really had any sort of not only guidelines, but something that we can point to that says, hey, I've got this code here. I've got these requirements that I have to behave and I have to follow. And they say that this is not right. We haven't had that kind of institutional backbone, if you will. And so for me, putting this in place and signing up to it and agreeing that this is something that I am going to abide by is something that I think it, first of all, it makes me feel good about myself and about the role of CISO, but it also, I hope, will help others look at us as a profession and say, we respect what they do, we trust what they're doing, they're working in the best interests of the company, the community, the people, and it helps us to just overall improve the lot, if you will, of the cybersecurity profession. So that's my kind of why me, why this for why me.
David?
Sure. Sure. I'm David Cross. I'm a former CISO at Oracle SaaS Cloud, and in a little bit, I'll be announcing on February 3rd, everybody, hopefully announcing my next role. So hopefully it'll be exciting on that. But I'm an acting CISO right now. So with that said, is that I'm really excited, about being part of the community, being part of the PAC is I kind of have a different take on it, right? And this is why I enjoy, working with everybody. Is I think of the code of conduct is I'm going to go back to my military days, even though it's been a long time, right? There's an element of it that is, hey, here is really of how we operate. I was in naval aviation, right? We have NATOPS, right? We learn from that. We know how to operate within that. We can train people on that. We can improve that. And then we become a trusted community, right? Of common policies and standards and operating principles to make us safe, right? In aviation, we have policies and procedures and practices so that we can operate in a safe way. In some ways, I think the code of conduct is just like that, is how we can learn from each other, how we can learn best practices, how we can improve things when we see something that goes wrong. And then we say that we're all certified aviators. We're all certified CISOs, our security community. And I think this is one of the best things that we bring to the community and help us all grow together.
Steve?
Hey everyone, I'm Stephen DeFore. I'm the Chief Security and Privacy Officer of Imbold Health. And when I look at the professional code of conduct and the principles, I really look at it as a foundation of predictability, right? Like there's so many different lead security roles out there in the world that being predictable in your conduct really gives credit to the role itself, and that's something that was missing in the industry and the profession as a whole. And so the predictability portion of it leads to further discussions that we'll have later on trust, right? Because as a leader in the security realm, you want to be able to influence, and the only way you can influence is through trust. And that's why I really appreciate the code of conduct principles.
Excellent. So let's dig in. So for the audience now, you've had a chance to meet what I'll call the experts, the people that have got lots of time and grade, understand what we're trying to do, and have put time and effort into this. So what I'm going to do is I'll start with Heather, which is Heather, pick one or two of the principles here that you think are most important and go into what they are and why they were chosen.
Okay, because I go first, I'm going to pick to me what is the easiest one, which is professional integrity, because I think everything hangs off of professional integrity. At all times, we have to behave with honesty. We have to, and it is self-referential, but we have to behave with integrity. And one of the things that was really interesting is when we were doing some research into other codes and what we wanted to have into our code of conduct, we did a lot of research into professional integrity. And every single profession out there has as kind of their guiding principle is professional integrity. And a couple of different associations went and did studies, and they said that everybody actually understands what professional integrity means. It's that little voice in your head when you are coaching somebody, where somebody comes to you for advice and says, should I do this? It's the answer of, if you look in the mirror, are you going to, would you tell your best friend that this was okay? If you look in the mirror, are you going to be proud of yourself and comfortable in the actions that you've taken? Have they done this? Have you behaved in a way that upholds standards of ethics, of morals, of honesty, of transparency? And so when I look at what we are trying to do with standards of practice, confidentiality, communications, conflict of interest, they all have a very, very strong element of professional integrity. And so when we, and when we look at the annotations in the code of conduct, we have the fundamental canon that says you shall strive to conduct all relationships with honesty and integrity. And then we have these rules of practice, which are the guidelines, right? Don't engage in professional conduct that involves dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation. Don't do something that reflects badly on the cybersecurity profession. Don't misrepresent your qualifications. Make sure that you are treating all people with dignity, respect, fairness, and without discrimination. And to me, if all else fails, if you are maintaining those as how you behave on a day-to-day basis, you're probably going to be okay with all of the other principles.
So if you can, I'm going to put you on the spot for all the others too, which is, can you give me an example, right, that we were thinking through around professional integrity from a cybersecurity perspective, that we realize why we're moving from a practice to a profession?
I'm not sure if this one follows in the practice to profession, but one of the examples that we talked about is related to the don't misrepresent your qualifications. And I think about how much pressure CISOs were in, and still are in, to become experts in artificial intelligence and generative AI, right? All of a sudden, we all had to stand up and opine on it. And we overnight were expected to be experts. If we were lucky, we had been paying attention and following the trends, and so at least knew where to go to get information. But I think that from a professional integrity point of view, there was a lot of pressure to behave as if you were an expert, as opposed to saying, this is what I know, right? Let's bring somebody else in to help us. And let's make sure that the advice that we are getting and the counsel that is being given by the CISO and by the security team is actually based on science, based on experience, based on research, as opposed to, I love the register, but what I read in the register last night.
There. Thank you. David, which principle or principles, right, top of mind for you and why?
Well, I've got an example of, conflict of interest sometimes, right? Well, maybe you can go all of them, right? I think of sometimes that, we can be in an organization and where that you're operating a certain principle. Let's say, I'll give it an example, right? I'll say this hypothetical example, right? An example where you've you've got a bug bounty program, you've received some research, on it and how they're interacting, with the disclosure researcher and things like that. And the organization, let's say the legal department decides like, no, this is not a vulnerability, this is not an exploit or things like that, and we're not going to pay out for this, we're not going to recognize that. And you may have a disagreement with that, right? And you agree with the researcher, or you have a disagreement with the decision on the state of that or the severity of that, and so that you choose to maybe take that information, right, and then potentially go and give it to another researcher or submit it to another bug bounty program because it maybe affects another technology or another customer or another organization, and doing it because A, maybe you want to make some money from it, but no one will know, right? Or B, you're really trying to kind of retaliate against your organization or your legal department or your company. And you did it as an insider, right? And that broke trust. That broke down everything, right? Is that if we cannot operate with trust, I'll go back to my military days, right? We have procedures, we follow. The moment you break that trust, you break those procedures, right? That's when things and people can be harmed. And this is one of the things that why we have to have, or why we do have codes of conduct, so we can always operate in a safe way, a trustworthy way, and in a way that we can ensure that the right outcomes occur.
Yeah, David, I think you nailed it. The predictability of your coworkers, yourself, whether it be in a military setting or not, really nails like why we have a code of conduct. So for me, professional integrity, standards of practice, confidentiality, those top three are really foundational in the code of conduct. I'm probably not supposed to choose favorites, but when we talk about trust, right, like we're talking about credibility,
Yep.
intent, reliability, these things, right? And so when we're working in our professional roles, signs of trust are not so obvious when they're there, but when somebody mistrusts us, right?
Yeah.
That's very, very apparent. So like signs of trust examples of that could be greater or more regular access to decision makers at the company, right? We're talking about the business owners. We're also talking about positive introductions, whether internal or external. Strategic involvement, right? How many times have we heard CISOs or leadership roles where they were very siloed? They didn't know what the other teams were doing. So like, how do we get those invitations? And it has to be built on trust, and it has to be built on reliability, right, of the profession itself.
Other thoughts from the panelists?
How do you top that? I mean, at the end of the day, that's what we're trying. Look, we are trying to, part of the reason to establish ourselves as a profession and why a code of professional conduct is so important is that we need to be seen as trusted partners. And this helps establish the trust because it provides the repeatability and the insight into what it is that we are going to be doing and how we're going to behave. But, Steve, if, you went in a different direction when we were talking ahead of time. You said something that I thought was also really interesting. You just mentioned a situation where you found that the code actually sort of helped you improve your business as well as yourself. I don't know if you remember what you were talking about, if you wanted to just kind of elaborate on that here.
I think we were talking about armor versus weapons, right? So question came up regarding the code of conduct and how it might be used against you, right? Like this thing, well, you're not doing this thing, so you're obviously not a trustworthy CISO or something to that effect. And I don't look at it that way. I don't look at good tenets or principles as something that can be used against you. If we're all in, so remember one of the annotations in the code of conduct is constant improvement, right? Like you need to be up to date in technology, business, or whatever it is your role requires, which means constantly learning, constantly improving. So these principles are there to make sure that you're constantly improving, right? So like there might be a gap in something that you perform, right? It's up to you to improve in that in that particular topic. So you nailed it with artificial intelligence. That thing came all of a sudden. Talking specifically about generative AI, right? All the risk associated with that. It definitely came really fast and really quickly. But it's up to us as professionals to adapt, right? To move on, to ask appropriate questions, right? And all of that leads to protect the business, right?
Yeah.
I can't resist, jumping in on one is I think as you're hitting the point about training, updating, and staying current, is I say we've taken security awareness training when I started working in the industry 20 years ago. So I never need security awareness training ever again. I took phishing training 5 years ago, never need it ever again, right? No unconscious bias. I had it once, never need it again, right? So how does that not apply to the code of conduct, everyone?
Great point. We figured out that we have to train people on that year in, year out, and in some cases even more frequently. And that there's, to your point, a bit of own medicine in there. We need to be continuing to learn our craft in order to be able to practice it.
So Tyson brought up a key concept here that I think we talked about, which is do no harm. Okay, that some of the certifications in cybersecurity, and I think as a profession, right, is we're obligated to do no harm. And these principles that are outlined here relative to that concept of do no harm, do you see a challenge with that overriding responsibility and that where there might be conflict with these principles?
I think this one is a really interesting one, and I know Tyson and I have been back and forth a couple of times because in the medical situation, do no harm is don't kill the patient, right? It's not always obvious what is going to cause harm or not harm, and if there's lesser harm versus greater harm, right? Anybody that's ever been in a crisis situation when you're sitting there going, do we pull the plug on internet access in order to protect the business, right? There you're trading off different levels of harm. And so I always get a little bit nervous with do no harm, but minimize the harm, minimize the impact. 100% I agree with.
And I think to your point, it's not necessarily impossible or possible to do no harm, right? And that's where some of the principles come in, right? So if you go back one slide to the list, one of them is communications, right? So like we as security professionals have to communicate risk, right? And it's not always us that makes the business decision. It might be the minority at the time. It might be 90% of the time we don't have that, right? It's our job to communicate that risk to the business units and allow them to make the decision. I think where the code of conduct also comes in with communication is ensuring that that communication is appropriate, not over the top and doomsdayish, right? That way, everybody who is a stakeholder in that particular risk can make an informed decision. So I think there's a healthy balance between do no harm, right, through omission or over the top reactions to a risk that you might have found, and allow the business owner to make that informed decision.
Well, and clear, concise, and accurate communication, Steve, to the point about trust. If people believe that you're going to be, that everything you say is, oh, there's the CISO, there's the security person doomsdaying again, and the sky is falling, we're not going to have trust. But if we are following principles about clear, accurate, responsible communication, we continue to maintain that trust. There's a really, you hear it all the time, right? Trust is won in droplets and lost by the bucketful, right? And each one of these things is how we help to maintain, to continually fill up our bucket so that we always have a bucket that is full of trust.
Well, I can just jumping in for a minute on it. It's another element is like when we can be data driven, we can quantify things and to help us make decisions because we know is everything a guaranteed, Boolean is, yep, you must do this or no, you don't do this, or there will be a risk or there's no risk. And it's the idea is that how you can be very like a doctor, I think we see a lot on the chat here, be doctors, be clinical, utilitarian, saying, here's the data, here's what we've seen historically, and here's the best historical record based on this data on the path to take, right? Whether it's helping someone that's injured or responding to a vulnerability, those type of things, and removing the opinions and agendas and just make thoughtful decisions that everyone could do together and understand why you made that decision, and it's based on the data.
I want to jump in. Quintana had a really great comment in the chat, which is it's our responsibility to set the temperature in the room, not match it. And I think that is really, really important for us to keep in mind. I love that. And I'm going to actually put that in as we build out our accreditation process. And that's one of the things that, explicitly, I think we need to have in there. Thank you, Quintana.
All right. So now I want to pivot to somewhere where Steve was going. So we've talked about the principles. We've talked about the profession, right? We've given examples and what was going into why we picked these 6. But the conversation we've had in depth as well, and I would like to have the panelist is this in essence, this code of conduct and the fact that you sign and operate against it, and that do no harm is kind of an overriding principle that we're trying to tease that apart, is that in essence, is you citing the code of conduct, okay, a weapon to be used against us or armor that we use to protect us. Okay, so as the doctors go, right, which was they can do no harm, they have an obligation to do the best they can, but it does give them protection. I'd like each of the panelists to talk about how they see it as either a weapon that can be used against us or armor to be able to protect us.
Yeah, I can take the initial stab at that one. Yeah, I really enjoy the metaphor. But I would replace a weapon with a hammer. To Heather's prompting earlier in the previous discussion, like I don't look at it as a weapon, right? Because if you're constantly improving, um, that's the goal, right? Like constantly improve to help protect the business and yourself, right? So if you make a mistake, right? You learn from it. You share that knowledge with your peers, right? That way they're better as well. So it's not a weapon against you, it's a hammer, right? You're hammering away at the armor, adding more plating, ensuring that you yourself and the business are protected. So that's my take on it. I'm sure, but I have a very positive outlook on people in the industry in general. So like David or Heather might have a different view on that.
Okay, I'll jump in. I think, look, anybody that's seen a James Bond movie knows that a teaspoon in the hands of the wrong person can be used as a weapon. And so I think the thing to do is to consider this. I actually consider this as like our superhero cape. This is our armor because this is the guidelines that we follow. And to me, the incredible strength and power that comes from the rules of practice is the rules of practice give us guidelines on how to interpret and how to behave. So if we're not sure, the rules of practice are kind of like, okay, but if you're doing this, then you are meeting the spirit of the code. And that's how we make sure that we are protecting ourselves. And, you know, if you're not sure, call the PAC. We have people who can help you with guidance. But to me, if you are working with integrity, right, which is why I go back to professional integrity is the one that is absolutely the most important. If you are behaving with integrity, if you can look at yourself in the mirror, if you would advise a mentee that this is what they are doing is okay, then you have the weight of all of these best practices behind you as a way to protect you that you were trying to do the right thing. Right. So now, if you are willfully disobeying the code and doing something that is just flat out illegal, right, then the code isn't going to protect you. But you know, you shouldn't be doing something flat out illegal, and you've broken professional integrity if you have.
So I maybe like to extend, I think what Heather is saying here, an element is it's not a set of laws. We have to follow the laws. They're not laws. They're not regulations, right? They're principles. And really, I think as Heather calling out, there's a set of best practices, right, for us to learn from and to us to use. But when there are best practices, do they apply to each and every possible scenario? Not necessarily, right? I'll give you an example saying, okay, we have an SUV and it has a car and the tires are supposed to be inflated at this pressure, correct? Is that the only pressure? Well, you're going in the desert, you're going into the sand, you're going to mud. Don't you change the pressure of the tires sometimes? So, oh, hang on, that was a different scenario, right? But that maybe that best practice didn't apply, right? But ultimately, it's the things to help guide us, they're principles, but they are not a set of laws or paths. That's the only thing that can be performed.
Those are great answers. And I really appreciate the thoughtfulness, but I'm going to hold your feet to the fire, all three of you, okay? Because nice job, okay, putting on the management hat. And I'm going to say, so I'm going to ask each of you this, and I want you to tell me how you would use the code of conduct, okay? This is the classic, okay? The CEO calls you in, right? in front of the executive team and says, all right, are we safe? How do you answer that question? And how does the code of conduct principles, would you use that to be able to answer the question, are we safe?
I hate that question.
I- And for the audience, they didn't know I was going to ask it, but see, this is the type of thinking we went into.
Yep.
Okay. And I didn't say, are we secure? That one's easier, right? What they're doing is they're now transferring all of that risk to you by asking you, are we safe? Right? And so, how do we use the code of conduct and the principles to be able to work our way through that conversation to what you all were telling me, which is, well, it's kind of about the business, right? And it's about doing no harm, but understanding how you have that conversation. So, how would you, each of you, think through the principles here to position the conversation you would have, are we safe? And I'm going to put Heather on the spot because she just loves this. So I'm going to let the guys have a chance to think about it. Heather, what would you tell me?
So first of all, I'm going to just, caveat and wiggle, because how you answer that question just so depends on the kind of relationship you have with the person that's asking that, right? So assuming you have a good trusted relationship with them, assuming that, you have been having conversations with them about your security posture, about just in general what it is that you are doing. What I would, first of all, I would really hope that it was something I could have as a conversation, not between floors 2 and 3 in the elevator. But assuming that this is a conversation that I can have, I would, and assuming the answer is, what I'm about to say, based on everything that we know today, I believe that we are managing the risk in a way that meets our business's expectations and requirements. But the reality is, in this current environment, that could change tomorrow. And, I don't want to say I don't know, but to get back to risk management, we're doing everything that we know how to do that is in line with what the business has told us they are willing to tolerate. And I believe the answer is yes. Now, if I believe the answer is no, then we have a different conversation. Hopefully, I have been letting people know that I don't think that we are. I think that that's a whole other conversation, and it is the harder conversation. But let me hear from Steve and David before we go and then do the, what do we do if the answer is no?
I'll go next on this one, and certainly, I think it was Narendra here that I think brought up a point is like similar to, are you healthy? And answer with data points, because that's the way I like to think about it. Because when they say you're asked that question, are we safe? So you have to look at the scenario, because every scenario is going to be slightly different. But then you then, based on that scenario or situation or state, right? You look at the data, right? And based on that data, and also based on your experience, with that type of data or scenario, right? You come up with a recommendation, right? And I think that in some ways, using no pun, it's like you become safe because you're saying, here's the data, here is, the experience with that data inside or outside the company, or your experience with it, and then a recommendation to mitigate or reduce the risk associated with that scenario. And that puts you into the case of like, here's my recommendation. And that is sometimes the best practice. But there's never a guaranteed it's a yes or a no, a Boolean again, right? It's that here's a scenario, here's the data, and based on all the data and observations and history of that, what was the recommendation to reduce that risk accordingly?
Yeah. Yeah. Being forced into giving a Boolean answer, kind of, this is where you need to be a politician and reframe it. As you said, David, reframe your answer.
Yeah, that's a good point by both of you guys. I don't know how I could follow up other than saying I agree. You really do have to put it in the context of it's this. You said it's the CEO, right? So like this, the person who's taking in the totality of all the business units and all of the risk, and he or she is asking you, are we safe? right? Which is different than are we secure? So if we use our existing data points, right, in our previous discussions with the risk owners, right, and assuming that everybody's informed about all of the knowns, right, we can also take into account potentially some of the liability that we hold as well, right? Like another topic that's come up in the chat, but in a different context, is insurance, right? Cybersecurity insurance, right? So, for example, the CEO might be asking you this particular question because of a brand new technology that they didn't take into account in their cybersecurity insurance, right? Through those discussions, you might realize that there is a gap, right? There's the risk appetite is being exceeded overall for the company, right? And those are those types of discussions you need to have. Going back to what Heather said, absolutely, you should not say I don't know, right? Because these discussions should have already happened to the extent that they can, right? And that goes back to I think it was David's point of continually updating people on those data points, right? That way people are informed, and that may not look like just once per year, right? Talking about significant changes in business as well to make sure everybody's informed and making those decisions.
I think what we're talking about here, Steve, and David, and everybody that's listening, is actually the really hard part of the Code of Professional Conduct, and that's the combination of communications and standards of practice, and that's delivering the hard messages, right? When the posture is not what it should be in your professional opinion, without any sky is falling, when you have taken into account the business's risk tolerance and the posture still is not sufficient. When, as Eric said in the chat, culture eats cybersecurity for lunch every day. This is where the code of conduct actually becomes almost like our strongest backbone and armor, is because that's where we are getting the guidance in how to help with the messaging that is necessary, so that when they come and say, are we safe? And you can then you can go with the binder and you can say, well, as I have stated repeatedly in every board memo, in every board meeting, in every ELD meeting, I do not believe that our risk posture matches our risk tolerance. I do not believe that our controls are effective. Here is the data to support this, right? That's where I think, the code actually really becomes powerful, because that's where we've got the reminder that this is in fact what we should be doing.
And I think somebody in the chat, Farhan, nailed it too. We're not talking about a fixed point, right? Like in ever evolving landscape where these continual discussions have to be had, right? So like somebody asks you that, like, how are we doing right now? Well, right now, we already remediated X, Y, and Z dollars, or increased budgets for this department, which alleviated this amount of risk, but also introduced this thing, right? So it's not a stagnant point in time, right? You really do need to take into account previous efforts, previous investments, liabilities, as well as the future investments, and share that knowledge. To your point, Heather, it's not doomsday, right? Like data driven, right? Dollars.
So and again, for the audience, when I asked that question, in my own mind, right, you answered in a very different way, all of you, because I was looking at the 6 principles, right, or the cheat sheet that you should be addressing and answering that question, right? Because that's your armor, right? That's the way that you're appreciating the politics of the situation versus just the technical requirements of the situation, in order to be able to go, are you having all 6 of those conversations? Are you balancing those 6 things to be able to understand how you stay alive another day? Okay, because that's what we're doing, right? So this is where the power, to what you were saying, of the principles, or if you operate under this umbrella, okay, and you can demonstrate that you're hiding in the herd, You can demonstrate that you're doing all the right things to earn a seat at the executive table. Yes, it's a fair amount of politics, right? But it's the reality of being a profession, right? A doctor doesn't just go in and willy-nilly cut into patients, right? They have a lot of considerations and a body of knowledge that go into that. Right? And I think a lot of the work that we're talking about here is all the work that went into these principles and code of conduct to do exactly that. Based on 40 years of experience, here are the key functions. Okay. So I'm going to ask the question slightly differently now for all of you on the board, right? I talk about responsibility versus accountability as a key component of the difference between moving from a practice to a profession, right? So many of us as technical CISOs at points in our career, I say we were responsible for protecting the company. We were responsible for putting security controls in mandating how the business operates. Okay. But the profession now is we're accountable to the business. Okay. And what we're responsible for versus what we're accountable for is the new language. So I'd like each of you to kind of respond to is how do you see the responsibility and the accountability of the CISO role and these principles being of value in that transition?
I'm going to have David go first because he's been off mute for so long.
Well, but the one thing is, I certainly I couldn't resist, kind of commenting there to Steve, saying, Steve, you're so good at using these playbooks, right? And experience. You should be a trainer. Oh, sorry. You lead by example so much. You're like, oh, anyways. Oh, sorry about everybody. Going to your question though is I think it's a really good one, and I think an element the principles really help define and set of the responsibilities and accountability in your role because it can provide clarity, right, inside your organization, with the other executives, is with your peers, and saying that it's sometimes sharing. It's like, here's what I'm going to do, here's how I'm going to operate, this is what I'm going to follow, right? And then everyone can have an understanding and visibility to it. So, for example, is we would say sometimes the best way to have the best performance is be very visible, right? If you are a black box, right, then how do people know what you're doing? And so I think one of the best practices here is that with your peers, with your executives, with your manager saying, hey, here's the principles by which I'm going to operate. Is there any disagreement, any misunderstanding? And then everyone knows that's your role and that's how you're going to operate. And it really helps have that clear definition inside your organizational culture and practices and playbooks. It becomes a great asset and it's a great tool.
Yeah, I like that answer because, in every single organization, what a CISO is responsible for, it's never the same across any two, much as we would like it to be. Yet, and what we are accountable for kind of differs on whether the company is on a happy path or a not happy path. But what we can control is our responsibility and accountability to these principles, right? We are accountable to ourselves for this behavior, and this helps us. And I think this sets us on the stage or the path that we want to take people on through the PAC. So I'm going to actually kind of go a little bit into advert mode, which is part of being a profession is not just having a code of conduct, but it's actually standards that are published and that we hold ourselves to. And that's what we're trying to do with the attestation and accreditation programs that we're running. And so members, we're going to have an announcement, we're hoping for Monday, about accreditation and attestation. And that is where we are going to learn how to do things like be the appropriate business partner, make that transition from the technology exec to the business partner so that we can have the conversations that mean we are not going to be caught out by a binary, are we safe? Yes or no question, because we've established ourselves as trusted partners and we have the relationship to be able to have this is a journey conversation. Here's where we are, here's where we need to be. It's going to take us this long to get there because of our risk posture, because of our budget, because of our business realities. But we are using our professional integrity in order to be able to have that conversation. The standards of practice ensure that we are communicating risks in a clear and transparent manner, that we are sharing information with our peers to make sure that we stay abreast of where we're going, that we are maintaining confidentiality, and that we are behaving. Interestingly, I thought we were going to spend the entire time talking about conflict of interest, right? That we are behaving in a way that we are going to not actually have to worry about it at all. That is the next step. Once we start practicing the code, is then becoming the type of business partner that embodies this code with the rest of the senior leadership team.
Yep. And with that, I want to thank the audience for the great engagement, right? We worked this concept of code of conduct, hopefully for the audience to see it wasn't just theoretical, practical. Why are we doing this? Why is it a profession? What are the true implications in the work that have gone into this? To the panelists, I want to say thank you. They did not know some of these questions were coming. You saw authentic CISOs put on the spot where almost everybody on this call can appreciate that's what it's really like, right? And how we can leverage these principles and our experience here to have the right conversation, a business impact analysis, right? Responsibility, authority, okay? And are we safe? Are we secure? That we understand how to work through those conversations, not to have a pat answer, but to have a risk conversation. And so I really appreciate Steve and Heather and David for giving me the latitude to push it into practical examples, right? And see everybody wiggle a little bit as they couldn't get away with just a good answer. They had to be authentic in understanding how to use the principles. And I think people appreciated that. So with this, I'm going to hand it back to Sarah to do final close for the PAC. And again, thank you all.
Pass by David because he's been waving his hand.
I'm sorry, David.
I'm sorry. I can't resist it. I'm going to be brutally honest. I think the chat with some of the members in the PAC here in contributing their insights and ideas here, this was one of the best I have seen in years, right? I took a lot of things away from this one as well. I think there's some great people here, a great community, and this was one of the best chats I have seen on a webinar in years. Sorry to share, but I had to jump in on that one.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for to the chat for helping me answer some. Appreciate it.
And I'll just jump in and say thank you, Steve, for leading this conversation. Also to Heather, Tyson, Stephen, David. This was really, really insightful. In case you came in late, just a reminder to save the date, April 30th at RSA. The day is going to start with a breakfast at 9 a.m. There's going to be workshops, networking opportunities, working groups to talk about topics, for CISOs, by CISOs. So please save the date, April 30th. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well,
Thank you.
We're only 5 days away from the RSA speaker submissions being approved. That's the word I've learned, is that in 5 days they're going to announce this, or people are going to get the notifications if they're in or not. So that was kind of an interesting tidbit I got just the other day.
All right. If the PAC people can go over to our debrief meeting, please, and then we'll just do our